I'm sure that all of these conversations are engaging and enlightening and informative, and that's a good thing to do. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's a couple of minutes after our starting time. Thanks for coming out to class this morning. Grateful for the presence of everyone who's here today. We'll start with a reading from Isaiah chapter 6. Change that. Isaiah chapter 40, verse number 6. I needed another sip of coffee before I said that. Isaiah 40. And I'll start reading at verse number 6. A voice says, "Cry out." And I said, "What shall I cry?" All men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, because the breath of the Lord blows on them. Surely the people are grass, and the grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. So there are some things that in life that are transient and temporal, and other things are unmovable and eternal. And it's good to know that the promises of God and the decrees of the Lord are eternal and will stand forever. So that if we stand with the Lord and we're on the Lord's side, then we are on the side of what lasts forever. So thinking about God's Word, thinking about Scripture in those terms, let's go back to the Songs of Ascents. And we are going to pick up this morning with Psalm number 126. Of these 15 Psalms, we have come to Psalm 126, which, like all the others, is given the title, A Song of Ascents. And it reads, "When the Lord brought back the captives to Zion, we were like men who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. And then it was said among the nations, 'The Lord has done great things for them.' The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. He who goes out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with him." Okay, so the background of these verses has something to do, clearly, with the return of Jewish exiles to Zion or Jerusalem. Maybe a best guess, or at least one guess, as to the historical background of the historical reference here has to do with the times of Ezra, Nehemiah, this great leader with the weird name, Zerubbabel. All right, it's kind of hard to spit out that name. But those people in the 6th century BC and the 500s BC are leaders who are related to, who are connected with, the return of Jewish people from what we call Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity after there was major regime change in the ancient Near East. So the Babylonians were on their way out, the Persians were on their way in, and Cyrus the Great is this Persian king who basically says, well, why do conquered peoples have to be exiled? Why do they have to be deported and live for decades on end in some place other than their ancestral homelands? As long as they obey Persian law, right? As long as they keep their nose clean and don't cause trouble anywhere in the empire, let them live where they want to live. And what this means for the Jewish people is that, of course, they can return from, again, their Babylonian captivity or Babylonian exile back to the land of Palestine. Seems to be what the first few verses there in Psalm 126 is referring to. Now, notice a word that in these first 3 verses, so if we divide up Psalm 126, you kind of notice that there's kind of a natural break at the end of verse 3 and then going into verse number 4, because verses 1 through 3 are celebratory And verses 4 through 6 issue a call for even more or greater or renewed restoration. So the Lord has done great things for us is the theme of the first 3 verses. But then when you look at the last 3 verses, there's this idea of restore our fortunes. Well, in verses 1 through 3, it sounds like he'd already done that. But now they're calling for more or additional or renewed restoration. Notice in those first 3 verses that a word that keeps coming up, well, at least more than once, it shows up twice, is the word joy over the experience of restoration. And then notice that you see that again at least 2 more times in verses 4 through 6. So this is interesting. Here we have a relatively short psalm, as most of these songs of ascents are, 6 verses, in which we have an occurrence of the word joy 4 times. So the theme is, right, we were joyful, sort of revive us again, right? Bring our joy back. And what this helps us to think about, I think, is that whether we're talking about Old Testament times, BC, or we're talking about the Christian era, AD, there's always this back and forth between we've been blessed, we've been given great gifts, we've been issued great promises, but there, in some ways, the fulfillment of the promise is not yet. And we get this as a theme in several New Testament passages. You say, well, doesn't the coming of Christ, doesn't the dawn of the Christian era sort of eliminate that? And it changes the dynamics of that back and forth, of that 2-part story, but it doesn't eliminate it. We still live with that as people in Old Testament times did. For example, in 1 John chapter 3 and verse number 2, listen to what the Apostle John has to say about the current status and future reality of the people of God. Beloved, now we are the children of God. So John just starts out by saying this is who he's writing to, a Christian audience, and he says right now, in the here and now, in this moment, we are the children of God. And what we will be, that's future, has not yet appeared. You hear what he's saying? We have a current status, but there is a future reality that has not yet arrived. Sounds a little bit like Psalm 126, doesn't it? The Lord has done great things for us. Now we are the children of God. Restore our fortunes. Restore the fortunes of Zion, says Psalm 126, verse 4. And John, in the same verse, in 1 John 3:2, says, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. What a great promise that is. What a thought that is. That with the appearance of Christ, when God brings down the curtain of history, Jesus comes again, and the kingdom is consummated, finally, fully. In that moment, what you, in your best moments, have been striving to do, to be like Christ, it will be complete. You will have arrived in that moment. And it will coincide with your vision of Christ, which is kind of interesting. I've never quite comprehended, I don't think, what that last part of 1 John 3:2 means when it says, we know that when he appears, we will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Well, there are a lot of people and things that I've seen, but I didn't become like them simply by seeing them. But John says that's exactly what's going to happen, right? With laying eyes, as it were, on Christ in the second coming, it will be the moment at which we will, your quest to be like Jesus, to follow in the footsteps of Christ, to be like your Lord and Savior, in that moment, it will have arrived. This is what Psalm 126 is calling for. The Lord has done great things for us, verses 1 through 3, but we will also want the Lord to restore the fortunes of His people. Just a kind of a historical or geographical, I guess, note. In Psalm 126, verse 4, restore our fortunes like the streams in the Negev. Negev is a Hebrew word that just means, it means south. And in the land of Israel, in Palestine, south is to them what west is to North America. Right? So you get further and further west beyond the Mississippi River, and it gets dry. It gets really, really dry. I mean, think about not just West Texas, think about places like Nevada, right? And there are lots of places in the American West where unless you have snow melt or you have something like a flash flood, a downpour, the creek beds are dry. So here in West Texas, we know it's a good year if there's water in the playa lakes. And there's water, I started to say ponds, but east of here they call it a pond. And in ranching country, I moved out to West Texas and I realized you don't call it a pond. Ponds are for picnics and pollywogs. When you're in ranching country, those are stock tanks. So they're tanks. And someone one time prayed from this pulpit and said, dear God, we're so thankful that our tanks are full. I thought, what tanks? Oh, I get it. Okay, the stock tanks, right? What back east you would call a pond. When those things are, life is good, but sometimes those are dry or nearly dry. And boy, what a desolate sight to see a playa lake, and you just kind of see that bleached out ring, and there's just no water in that pan of the playa lake. And and there are images like that you get in the southern part of Palestine, like streams in the Negev. Are we talking about a dry creek bed, or are we talking about a flowing or full creek bed? Is what he's looking for. That's something maybe we can relate to a little bit. Questions, another passage relating this idea of the already but the not yet. Hebrews 2 and verse 8. So the question is Jesus Christ Lord of all? Well, he sure is. I mean, Jesus Christ, is Jesus Christ Lord? Yes. Are there people, places, situations, and just, within a half mile or less, where Jesus Christ is not in control of that situation, right? The lordship of Christ is not acknowledged in that relationship or in that home or in that place. And to ask is to answer. And Hebrews 2 and verse 8 gives expression to this. Talking about God the Father, the writer says, now in putting everything in subjection to Him, that is to Christ, He, God the Father, left nothing outside of His, that is Christ's, control. At present, right now, we do not yet see everything in subjection to Him. Right? So is Jesus Christ Lord? Sure is. Is he currently acknowledged as Lord everywhere on planet Earth? Well, to ask is to answer. No, He is not. So there's some aspects in which the lordship of Christ is actual, real, true. Couldn't be any more true than it is. But because of human will and because of human sin, that lordship of Christ is not acknowledged everywhere in the world. Now, there's coming a time, again, with the return of Christ, with the consummation of the kingdom of Christ. Right? That's going to change, isn't it? And every eye will see, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of the Father, but not yet. Right? And so we get that already but not yet dynamic in Psalm 126, which, again, although the Christian age has dawned, that dialogue, that back and forth is still persistent. Questions or comments about this psalm before we move on to 127? Let's read it. A song of ascents. This one is said to be of Solomon. It's the only one of the 15 that Solomon's name is attached to. Unless the Lord builds the house, its builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchmen stand guard in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for He grants sleep to those He loves. Sons are a heritage from the Lord, children a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their enemies in the gate. You notice the first two verses, I should say. So there seems to be a break, kind of a transition, and a new theme that's introduced at the beginning of verse number 3. There are some links there. But those are basically the two halves of Psalm 127, verses 1 and 2, followed by 3 through 5. So there are three activities in verses 1 and 2. Building a house, keeping watch over a city, and then much more generally in verses 1 and 2, this idea of going about the everyday business of life. And what do these three things have in common? Unless those things are the work of God, unless God accompanies that work or those efforts, unless the Lord is in the midst of that, behind that, then what is its character? What is its quality? It's vain, kind of useless, worthless. Okay, we'll come back to that idea. And then in verses 3 through 5, this idea of the significance of family. So what I take from Psalm 127 is there are all kinds of things that you can do, you can be involved in, that if the Lord is not the reason for that, right? If God's not receiving the glory, if it's not consistent with the will of God, then these are vain activities. But speaking about activities that aren't in vain, building up a solid family, right, can't be wrong. It's one of those things that's right and good and true and noble, and it just can't be wrong. And it's sort of the gift that keeps on giving, right? From one generation into the next. If you have a solid family, right? This is why the church regularly underscores the significance of marriage, the importance of parenting, right? The vitality of faithfulness in our relationships, in our family relationships. What great dividends these pay. How much real wealth and security, honor, good pride come to a person as a result of building up a solid family. And again, to ask is to answer. We know, right, from experience. We know from observation about this. When I think about Psalm 127 and the possibility of something being a really big project, expensive, lots of time and effort put into it, the possibility of that being vain versus the significance of an honorable family, I think about Genesis chapter 11. You remember that at the beginning of Genesis 11, we read about a city, Babel or Babel. And this city, large group of people, decide to build a tower. And the reason? What's the reason for building the tower? Right? Genesis 11, verse 4. This tower, they say, here are their prospects. It will reach up to the heavens so that we will make a name for ourselves and keep from being scattered over the face of the earth. Now, question, are these people going to be scattered over the face of the earth? Yes, they are. Right? God's going to go down and confuse their language. So what they intended to prevent with the construction of the tower actually became reality. Now, doesn't that happen sometimes in life? You know, Peter says to Jesus, listen, Jesus says, listen, the shepherd is going to be smitten and the sheep are going to be scattered. And what does Peter say? Not me. Even if everybody else cuts and run, yet not will I, forsake you. And Jesus says, Peter, it's later than you think. Right? Before tomorrow morning, not once, but 3 times you will have denied me. You will have forsaken me. Right? So a lot of times what people say, I'm going to make absolutely certain that never happens. Right? And quite frequently the thing that we feared, that we tried to prevent, actually comes true. This is what happens to the people at the beginning of Genesis chapter 11. The tower will be our claim to fame, they say, and a landmark that people will rally around, and this is going to ensure the future prosperity and the unity of the tower, the city of Babel. And it came to absolutely nothing. In the very same chapter, at the end, there is a man by the name of Terah. And Terah has 3 sons, including one whose name was Abram. And in the next chapter, Genesis 12, God says to Abram, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And what has come of that? Just everything that really matters. Right? So people can work in vain, but when people, in keeping with God's plan, build up a good family, an honorable family, that's the blessing that keeps on giving from generation to generation. And love this. And it's not easy, is it? I was reading a commentator by the name of Derek Kidner, and he talks about this imagery in verses 4 and 5, that the sons are they're like arrows in the father's, the man's quiver. And Derek Kidner's comment was, it's not easy to build a family, is his reflection. And he says, these boys were probably a handful before they were a quiverful. Right? And isn't that the case? Right? So it's not easy to build. It takes time and effort to build up a noble, honorable, cohesive family. But what good things come from that? In the same way that the parents took care of the children, there comes a time when those roles kind of get reversed. And now the children, who are themselves honorable, right, dependable, reliable, resourceful adults, have the ability and the will, right, to take care of the parents. And how many times have we seen that, right, in life, where good parents wind up having these responsible children who are in turn able to care for their parents in some ways very similar to what the way the parents took care of the children when they were little, when they were young. What a blessing that is. So this is kind of a wisdom. Some people call this a wisdom psalm. This has to do with kind of like the Proverbs, how you live your life. And here are the characteristics and behaviors and attitudes that lead to success and prosperity and good. And here are the characteristics and behaviors and attitudes that lead to downfall. So do the former and avoid the latter. And generally speaking, your life will be accompanied by very good things. Something about any of that we're looking at here. Are we ready for 128? The blessed, happy life. So we have a little bit more of this idea of how to live your life. Blessed are all who fear the Lord, who walk in His ways. You will eat the fruit of your labor. Blessings and prosperity will be yours. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your sons will be like olive shoots around your table. Thus is the man blessed who fears the Lord. May the Lord bless you from Zion all the days of your life. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem, and may you live to see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. Okay, so in the same way that we've seen words like joy be a theme word, kind of a buzzword within a particular psalm, we get this again in Psalm 128, and this is the language of blessing. Someone is blessed, and a person blesses and receives a blessing. So we noticed this as we were going through. Question, verse number 1, who are blessed people? What are the two things about them according to verse 1? What is it about blessed or blessed, however you want to pronounce that, people? They fear the Lord, so they revere God. inwardly, you might say. I think of this as kind of inside and outside, right? So because of a person's inward reverence for, fear of the Lord, outwardly, what do? They obey Him, right? And so it kind of reminds us of that song, when we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. So there's kind of an inward trust that leads to outward obedience, inward fear of or reverence for God, which leads to walking in His ways. What a great capsule statement of what it means to live for God, what it means to live for the Lord. I revere God inwardly, I obey God outwardly. Question 2, how does being blessed by the Lord show itself, according to Psalm 128? So when you're blessed, what's it look like for a person to be blessed? Prosperity, right? Good things happen. Doesn't necessarily mean we become rich by everyone else's standards, but it means that we have what we need. And there's this business again from Psalm 127. We get an echo of that with this idea of the good family. All right, so generally speaking, people who reverence God and who obey His will, and by the way, I mean, in terms of missions history, this pans out. I mean, this has been borne out many, many times. In fact, church growth and church historians, those kinds of people, they've got a name for this. It's called redemption and lift. And what redemption and lift basically say is that living the Christian life is good for you. So if you look at places where the gospel has gone for the very first time, and then go forward 50 or 60 or 100 years, and you see kind of intergenerational development within churches, what you see in those societies is that the people who have obeyed the gospel and lived the Christian life, I mean, materially, just in terms of prosperity, they are better off than the mean or the average in that society. Christianity generally means that husbands and fathers become better husbands and fathers. It means that, wives and mothers become better wives and mothers, right? And then this reverberates within the lives of the next generation of the children. And again, people who are kind of like demographers or students of missions history, they call this redemption and lift. It actually has a name. And this is exactly what Psalm 128 is talking about. It manifests revering the Lord and doing His will, manifests in prosperity and a good family. And then in verse 5, the blessedness of the man and his family who are being described in this psalm is extended as this is a hope for all Israel, for all of God's people. What is true in the case of this person and this family that's being described in the psalm, may that be true of all of God's people. May that be true for the whole church. Isn't that our wish? Isn't that our desire? That you could identify a church and say, here is the best example of a Christian family within this congregation, let's say. And we would hope, right, it would be our prayer, that would be characteristic, that would be common, it would be true of every family within the entire congregation. Is our hope, that's our desire for all of God's people to have that blessed, good life. Psalm 129. There's some ugliness here. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth. Let Israel say, they have greatly oppressed me from my youth, but they have not gained the victory over me. Plowmen have plowed my back and made their furrows long, but the Lord is righteous. He has cut me free from the cords of the wicked. May all who hate Zion be turned back in shame. May they all be like grass on the roof, which withers before it can grow. With it the reaper cannot fill his hands, nor the one who gathers fill his arms. May those who pass by not say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you. We bless you in the name of the Lord. Okay, so God's people have they're like everyone else, right? We have some bitter experiences, bad memories of the ways in which people have treated us. Do you have scars on your back? This author seems to have that, and sort of speaks for a nation, as it were, with scars on its back. By the way, if we have any doubt, right, that these poems, which also function many times as prayers or as statements about, affirmations about the good life, if we have any doubt that these poems were sung, notice that you get in 128 the same phenomenon that we saw back in 124, and that is, it's like the song leader starts the psalm and then does what we sometimes, see in a concert or whatever, sing it with me, right? And then we start back again. So in 124, look at the very beginning. If the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say. Here we go. It's almost like the title of the song has been announced. And then now we're going to sing it, right? So if the Lord had not been on our side, let Israel say. If the Lord had not been on our side, that's where the congregation joins in, right? You get this again in 128. 129, the one we just read. They have greatly oppressed me from my youth, let Israel say. They have greatly oppressed me from our youth. That's how you start the song, evidently, in ancient Israel. Kind of a technique there that's built right into the psalm for getting the song going. Verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 129. Kind of interesting. The histories of nations are typically stories of achievement. Right? So the Declaration of Independence and Revolutionary War and George Washington and the Constitutional Convention and the U.S. Constitution, these are some of the achievements, right? Government of the people, by the people, and for the people, etc. National histories tend to be histories of achievements, great landmarks in the life of our nation. The history of Israel tends to be different from that. In fact, it's by contrast, the history of Israel is not a story of achievement. It's a story of survival. Right? It's a story of persistence. Yes, there are high moments. There are great times in the history of Israel. But throughout, right, this is the story of people who have endured. Not too many nations, not too many empires can say, oh yeah, there once was a time when we were a slave nation for centuries, hundreds of years. Slave nation. But Israel could say that. And that may be the specific reference that we're getting in Psalm 129. I have scars on the scars on the scars on my back, verse number 3. Plowmen, just think about, someone's back like a plowed field. And that's the comparison, right, here in verse number 3. They've made their furrows long, right? My entire back. Right? It looks like a plowed field. But the Lord is righteous. Is verse number 4 a reference to the Exodus? He has cut me free from the cords of the wicked. Is this a personal experience that kind of sizes up the national experience of the people of Israel? I don't know. There were other times, of course, after the Exodus, after the conquest of Israel, after the time of Joshua, when God's people were defeated, they were overrun. And this, usually in the Old Testament stories that talk about that, it's not simply that the people fell into or were dominated in a situation of slavery, but they had violated the covenant regulations, right? They had violated the will of God. They had fallen into idolatry. And God says the way that we're going to solve this is the people are going to be oppressed for at least a generation, and they are going to learn their lesson from this, that if you violate the stipulations of the covenant, if you practice idolatry, if you disobey, these are the kinds of things that are going to happen to you. You're going to be defeated militarily. And then in time, of course, God would show them mercy and rescues them. This leaves open the question then of the status or the standing of Israel's oppressors. People who did bad things from the worst of motives against the Lord's people. And what the psalmist says very indignantly indignantly and very kind of angrily, is may those people be put to shame, become worthless, and denied a blessing. Okay. This raises the question of what about when the Psalms curse, right? What about when the Psalms express what can only be regarded as, ill will towards other people? As God's people, are we supposed, is it appropriate to hate other people? If Christ died for all, and according to 2 Peter, God has been putting off the second coming of Christ because He's merciful, not willing that any should perish, right? But that all should come to repentance. If that's the will of God, is it my business to hate any of those people? Okay, it's tough, isn't it? Because there are people in the world who are truly blameworthy, right? We don't have too many qualms about saying, this person is evil. This person hasn't simply made mistakes or even committed sins. We've made mistakes. We've committed sins. I like to think I'm within a group of people that are not characterized by evil, but there are some people who are characterized by evil. How do you separate out, right, the evil that person has committed from the fact that this person was intended to be and was created in the likeness and in the image of God, just like the rest of us? And I think this is exactly why it's become cliche by now, but the language of, hate the sin, love the sinner. But I don't know, I can't bring myself to love Adolf Hitler. I just have a hard time, having warm, fuzzy feelings about Joseph Stalin or Pol Pot or people like that. And then lesser offenders whose names aren't so ignominious. How do we handle that? I think one of the first things we have to do that's really important, particularly in the cultural moment that we live in right now, is slogans, stop hate, eliminate hate, and my response to that is no, because any truly good person is always going to hate that which is not good. If we don't hate evil, how can we claim to be good? If I don't despise evil and its consequences, I think I would have to conclude about myself that I'm not a truly good person. And by the way, both Old and New Testaments reflect on this. Psalm 97 verse 10 says, "You who love the Lord, what do? Hate evil." It's like a command. Like, this is what you do if you love God. You hate evil. This isn't just, that's Old Testament stuff. Paul in Romans chapter 12 verse 9 says that Christians should hate what is evil and cling to what is good. So when people say, stop hate, as though inherently it were a bad thing, I think the Christian response to that has to be no. We're not going to stop hating what is evil, because if we quit hating what was evil, we would not be God's people. We would not be thinking like God.
What did Jesus do when he cleared the temple?
Say again?
Jesus, when he cleared the temple, he was really upset with the fact that they were using it as a...
Made a whip.
Yeah.
Right? Jesus makes a whip. Right? Jesus, meek and mild, right? Couldn't hurt a flea. That guy actually made a whip. He didn't buy one. He's like, no, with tender loving care, I'm going to make my own whip, right, that I'll use. Turns over tables, right? So when was the last time you carried in a whip into a place and turned the tables upside down? And Jesus did that. I'm not saying go do that today so you can be more like Jesus. But here's a guy who just cannot stand the idea that the money changers are doing their thing, right, in the temple, and they've basically, is this the house of God, or is this a Las Vegas casino? And Jesus says, we're going to protect the integrity of the place where God meets with his people by driving out what is opposed to the will of God. And he does it very effectively, doesn't he? Okay, so I think that if, one of the things that, and in Psalm 129, wow, there at the end is like, I want these people to never get a blessing, to be disdained, to be incapable of receiving a blessing, and never, I don't want the blessings to ever be pronounced on you. And we say, well, that has a lot to do with the raw emotion of what this person is reflecting on and what that person has experienced. And I mean, let's face it. I mean, there are times when we say, oh, we know Jesus from the cross said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And there have been times when you have thought, Father, don't forgive them, because they know exactly what they're doing, and they keep doing it anyway. Right? I mean, I'm not the only one, right? Okay. Okay, and a lot of cultural advocates for Stop the Hate it's kind of acceptance of anything and everything, which means, and I think one of the things that Christian people, we sometimes have a hard time sizing this up or have a hard time enunciating this, but I think what we're really looking at in our cultural moment right now is nothing other than an assault on the Creator, because God makes two people, right? They're male and female, and he declares that good. And our culture declares that negligible, right? It's just completely malleable, right? And the two positions, the two outlooks, could not be more opposed than they are. They could not be more different than they are. And I think this is what makes God's people, makes Christian people, nervous, unsettled about the culture, and it is significant, absolutely significant. And I think one of the most important things that we can do is to simply uphold, what tradition and biology and the natural order of things keep telling us over and over and over again, and that is God is not the author of confusion and chaos. Right? God is the author of order. And that order has to be acknowledged and recognized, or else you have a society that will come unraveled. We're out of time. I would like for us to be able to get to, Michelle has a comment. Can you make it quick, dear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So, you're talking about hate the people, and I think that isn't so much about hate the people, but hate what they're doing to force to hope change for what's right. So it's still not hate the people, it's hating what we do to teach them what's right.
That's right.
Just like when we, push a person who's not in the church anymore, and hopefully disfellowshipping or whatever you call it is going to want them to come back.
Right. That's right. Thanks for your attention this morning. We'll pick up there next week.